The presentation today is based on a paper of the same title, and the question that I'm going to try to answer today, at least drawing on these three central Asian cases that I'll talk about, is why dictators, or actually aspiring dictators, sometimes close parliament. And what I'll argue is that doing so creates an opportunity for institutional reform, and those reforms in turn help tame parliaments that after a transition, like the collapse of the former Soviet Union and the emergence of these former ethnic republics as independent countries, they often emerged with parliaments that were not quite as amenable to being pushed around as some of the presidents in those republics who later went on to become dictators would have liked. And so in short, when aspiring dictators close parliament, it's part of the process of consolidating power. And this is something that I look at in three Central Asian cases: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan, under the three presidents, Nazarbayev, Akayev, and Karimov. And I looked at these cases because all three became authoritarian, and initially conditions in them were quite similar. So they had this shared experience of single-party communist rule. Obviously, they were all Soviet republics before that transitioned at the same time. And in addition, their economies were all based on commodity exports. So they had similar economic conditions coming into independence, as well as strong regional divisions based on identity that have sometimes been referred to as being clan-based. And again, they had no history of independent statehood or democracy that could potentially influence whether parliaments were more democratic or more viable. But they had different experiences with parliamentary closure. And before I go on, I want to talk about why it would be puzzling that an aspiring dictator would close parliament. That might intuitively seem like something that just dictators do. But actually, there's a lot of literature and political science that talks about how elected assemblies, how parliaments help dictators. They help manage elites by providing them a way to co-opt the opposition, and in doing so, make it more difficult for them to contest the president or the dictator for power. They provide a forum in which he can monitor his allies, which is really important because the most common way in which dictators are overthrown is via revolt from among key elites. And so by shoving them all into parliament, it makes it easier to keep track of them. And elected assemblies have also been shown to improve economic growth in countries by reducing expropriation, for example, because all the elites can monitor each other, so they're less likely to take each other's property or wealth. And so this benefits the economy overall by making it more stable. And finally, legislatures also help dictators obtain information. So seeing who is popular or what sorts of policies are proposed is useful to dictators who otherwise often have trouble finding out exactly what's going on because people fear repression, and so they just tell them what they want to hear. The parliament provides a sort of safe space in order for those views to be aired, and in doing so, lets the dictator address those concerns before it becomes the the basis for some kind of a revolt. But what's often forgotten about in the political science literature is that legislatures can also be a threat. And so the intuitive starting point that you might think of with legislatures in authoritarian regimes is that, well, they're just a rubber stamp. Then there was this literature that I just discussed that talks about how they actually help dictators. And so what I'm adding here is this idea that they can also threaten them. And in particular, stolen elections. So if voters and candidates are aware that the result, that there was widespread fraud or results were tampered with, well, that can actually motivate them to revolt against the dictator and overthrow him. And in addition to providing information and allowing the dictator to monitor elites, legislatures are also a forum that can connect elites, and by creating these connections among them can help facilitate collective action. And actually, this is exactly what Scott Radnitz argues happened in the case of Kyrgyzstan with its tulip revolution, that disparate elites who had never all been together in one place formed connections that enabled them to then bring people out onto the streets against the regime. So how do we reconcile this idea that a legislature can be both a tool of a dictator or an aspiring dictator and a threat? And in a post-transition context, this is an especially relevant question because there's still a lot of uncertainty. And so the future path of the country is a little more in flux. And elites in parliament are therefore more likely to challenge the executive for political power. And so the dictator or wannabe dictator needs to transform this parliament that he's inherited in from the Soviet period in these three cases, from a potential threat to something that's much more firmly a tool that will help him out. In the short term, this is about changing perceptions about the devolution of power and raising barriers to collective action among those elites that are suddenly brought together in parliament. In the long term, it's about reinforcing perceptions among key elite groups that they're better off working with the dictator than trying to overthrow him. Because remember, the biggest threat to most dictators comes from elites that are near the top. And so immediately after the Soviet Union collapsed and you had this transition to independence with these inherited Supreme Soviets in each republic, these inherited parliaments, and the former first party secretaries in most cases becoming the new president, these three leaders had to make a series of strategic choices. The first was with respect to continuity or change regarding economic policy and the Communist Party. So did they continue to have an economy that was primarily state-owned, or did they introduce economic liberalization? And what did they do with the Communist Party structure? Did they dissolve it, or did they repackage it under a different label? They also had to decide whether to try and compromise or crack down on powerful regional elites, because remember, all three countries, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan, had really strong regional elites. And what they did with respect to those elites really changed perceptions and expectations about how political power would be divided in the country. And they then needed to enact institutional barriers. So they needed to change the rules of the game to make it more difficult for elites to coordinate. Either that, or they needed to cede some power to the elites and engage in power sharing. And the asterisk is here because enacting those institutional barriers, making it more difficult for elites in parliament to coordinate, inevitably tended to attract some opposition from members of parliament who saw it rightly as eroding their own power. So in order to enact those rule changes, dictators, aspiring dictators, needed to close parliament to push them through in another way. And once those rules were enacted, then that in turn changed perceptions about what was possible and whether parliament could actively challenge the president for power. And then over the long term, keeping parliament in these different countries under control and making sure it went along with what the dictator wanted required a few different things. Access to patronage resources. So it helped elites to want to stay on board with the president if he had access to, let's say, oil money, as in Kazakhstan, in order to give them some perks for going along with him. And so it required distributing those resources to elites accordingly, while also disrupting key regional linkages so that regional elites were divorced from their base of power, as well as the use of coercion. So when the three republics became three independent countries in 1991, the presidents faced similar challenges. There were, again, these deep regional divisions, and there was intense conflict with the Supreme Soviet because, again, the Soviet collapse created a lot of uncertainty. And whereas before, Supreme Soviets really had just been these sort of rubber stamp institutions, all of a sudden they were parliaments in independent countries. And while these countries had systems that gave more power to the president formally, whether or not that was actually going to be the case in reality was unclear. So there was intense conflict, especially over things like economic policy, between the president and the Supreme Soviet. And in the case of Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, Akayev and Karimov, the presidents had an unconsolidated base of support. So they came to power really as compromise candidates toward the end of the Soviet period. And as a result, there wasn't a unified bloc behind them, whereas Nazarbayev had been a pretty unanimous promotion to the position of first secretary in Kazakhstan. So there was a lot of contention over them holding and consolidating political power. So here's a nice picture of the three of them together. In Kazakhstan, Nazarbayev initially followed a reformist path. So if we think back to those factors that ended up being critical, when it came to regional elites, he took a pretty conciliatory approach and didn't immediately try to confront them. He engaged in a pretty sweeping plan of economic liberalization, so ending a lot of state ownership of enterprises and things like that. And he dissolved the Communist Party. So he held the presidency, and he had the Supreme Soviet that had initially been on board with him coming to power, but it was no longer beholden to any kind of institutional or party structure. And as resistance grew to many of his economic policies in particular, the Supreme Soviet began to challenge Nazarbayev, and he became very frustrated that he was unable to really do much of anything. So he made a tour of the country that suspiciously led to the dissolution of a lot of local Soviets, a lot of these local parliaments. And then following a closed-door meeting with the then Speaker of the Supreme Soviet, the Supreme Soviet disbanded. And it's difficult to confirm, but some of the former deputies discussed this as a sort of buying off. So those who went quietly into the night subsequently found very nice positions in the regime. And so during this interim, when parliament was closed, Nazarbayev was ruling alone. There was no Soviet to challenge him. And he used that opportunity to change some of the electoral rules to make it more difficult for opposition-minded deputies, for the people who had been giving him trouble, to have a seat in the parliament. But despite a parliament that had a whole lot of deputies from a state-approved list, so a list that Nazarbayev had approved, or from a pro-presidential party, the new parliament that came into power wasn't any less feisty, and again began to, so here's a breakdown of the parliament that came back, that was elected after the dissolution, and you'll see there's 42 deputies from a state list, and then this was the president's party that he created. But that parliament again was challenging Nazarbayev especially over his economic policy and for political power. So again, he dissolved parliament, this time by using a constitutional court decision that ruled the election unconstitutional on fairly suspicious grounds. And again, while parliament was closed, he introduced a new constitution and rule changes that made it next to impossible for opposition members to win a seat in parliament. So parliamentary closure was really used to consolidate his control and get rid of those deputies who were causing him trouble. So by 1999, that process of authoritarian consolidation was well underway. He did close parliament 3 more times. In 2007, there were some more electoral reforms and party development that really wiped out any of the remnants of an organized opposition. And in 2011, there were terrorist attacks and then labor unrest in Zhanaozen that led to the dissolution of parliament as probably, and new elections as probably a referendum on the regime to try and bolster the appearance of popular support. And there was a similar issue in 2016 when it was dissolved. So the Kazakh case suggests that parliamentary closure followed by elections may also, in these last few examples, serve a legitimation function in regimes where the dictator has already consolidated control. So parliamentary closure may be a tool to complete the grasp of power, but also serve other functions in older regimes. So turning to the case of Kyrgyzstan, Akayev found himself, just like Nazarbayev, with a lot of resistance from the Supreme Soviet over both electoral and land reform. And that conflict was exacerbated by not just a sort of non-conflictual relationship or approach to dealing with regional elites, but actually devolving power to them. So these regional elites that already controlled pretty powerful patronage networks saw even more political power given to them. And this really shifted perceptions in Kyrgyzstan about the balance of power between the regional elites who were represented in parliament, in the Supreme Soviet, and Akayev. And as in Kazakhstan, there had been a dissolution of the Communist Party. So there was no institutionalized party to sort of keep these elites potentially in check. And unlike in Kazakhstan, where Nazarbayev had control of oil resources that he could use to reward those who, for example, went quietly when he did dissolve the parliament, in Kyrgyzstan, this really didn't exist, at least not initially. This changed in 1994 when there was a large influx of foreign aid. And this provided Akayev with really a missing piece of the puzzle. He suddenly had patronage resources that he could use to deal with parliament. And this led a quorum, there were a quorum of legislatures to boycott the parliament, which then allowed Akayev, based on a technicality in the constitution, to dissolve the assembly entirely. So he sort of peeled off enough support using patronage that allowed him to dissolve the assembly. Again, as in Kazakhstan, enact a series of electoral reforms as well as a new constitution, and return a more pliant parliament to power. So there was this crackdown on opposition and openness in general that followed, but it didn't last. So whereas in Kazakhstan, Nazarbayev successfully closed parliament, changed the rules, consolidated power, and stayed there. In 2005, a revolt led to Akayev's downfall. So he succeeded in temporarily taming parliament, but it came back to bite him, likely because of the continued strength of regional elites and his attempts to crack down on them. This led later elections to become a rallying point for those elites he was trying to push out of parliament, and proved his downfall. In Uzbekistan, Karimov succeeded in taming parliament without closing it, which is an interesting case. So he, after independence, took a very different approach from Nazarbayev and Akayev. He undermined regional elites' local power bases rather than trying to work with him as the other two leaders had done. And he didn't really dissolve the Communist Party. Instead, he relabeled it and kept those structures in place, which made it, these two things combined, made it much easier for him to shift expectations about what the balance of power would ultimately be between the parliament and the president. So by acting quickly and decisively to deal with regional elites and keeping a party structure in place to reward or punish those who went for or against him, respectively, he shifted expectations and never really had to close parliament in order to change the rules, the electoral rules in particular, that made it possible to remove opponents from key positions and enhance his own authority. So parliament never really emerged as a serious challenge to his authority in the same way that it did in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. So all of these things together, again, shifted expectations about the utility of being in opposition. It really just didn't look like you were going to do well if you took that path. And this led to a virtuous cycle, not really virtuous in that it led to the consolidation of authoritarian rule, but for Karimov, it was his preferred outcome. And indeed, he stayed in power until his death in 2016. So looking at these three cases of parliaments after a transition shows that aspiring dictators close parliament as part of the process of authoritarian consolidation if they don't initially act decisively to tame, to shift expectations and tame the parliament. So that step is only needed, the step of closing parliament is only needed if they first fail to establish the perception that resistance is futile. And the key factors that in bringing Parliament to heel in order to consolidate their rule include strategic institutional reform. So not just changing the rules, but when you change them and how you do so. Having control over economic resources in order to provide patronage and buy enough support to enact institutional reform, and disrupting regional elites' bases of power in order to prevent them from emerging as an allied force against you, as well as organizational capacity, so whether or not there's a ruling party that you can rely on. Let's see. So this was a presentation that drew fairly heavily on, let's see, stop share, there we go. That drew fairly heavily on a lot of political science literature. So if, I understand there might be questions about that or more generally, and I'll open up the floor for that. I think Irina's going to moderate. So.
Sure, yes, absolutely. And as always, we welcome questions in the chat. If not, and you have your video on, you can raise your hand and I'll call on you, or you can use that raise hand function that Alma pointed us to, that if you go to participants, you can just do a little raise hand. And Ellie, you typed a question into the chat, but do you want to just ask it yourself, or do you want me to read it out loud for you?
Oh no, I can ask it. So this is maybe a little bit off topic, but still on topic, just shifting from Central Asia to Russia. I'm just interested generally, what are your thoughts on the recent developments in Russia, concerning the recent constitutional changes? And what comparisons can you make, if any, between the authoritarianism that you've talked about in Central Asia and what's been happening in Russia?
So one comparison that I think that initially it seemed like we could draw, that these constitutional changes maybe say we indicate Putin's going another route, is that when Nazarbayev stepped down from power, he resigned as president and handed the reins formally to the Speaker of the Senate. But before he did that, he transformed the Security Council, which had been an advisory body, into this really powerful institution. And he basically remained sort of the power behind the throne. And there were some similar changes in Russia where it initially seemed like Putin might be doing something similar. And then we see this constitutional referendum, and it seems like he's not taking the Nazarbayev route so much, and instead is going to rely on his public support, even though it's declining, in order to remain in charge fairly indefinitely. So that was, it was initially interesting that Putin seemed to be following Nazarbayev's example as a way to step back while technically remaining within the bounds of the constitution, but still keep a hold on power, but that doesn't seem to be occurring. As for sort of at the beginning of the post-Soviet period, I think Russia is a pretty unique case in a lot of ways, just because it was the center of the Soviet Union. So I don't think these arguments necessarily apply there the same way they would in the Central Asian republics were almost akin to colonies. So I think there's probably more parallels with post-colonial states and the Central Asian republics than there would be between Russia and them.
Okay, Christopher, I see you got your hand up, so please go
Yes,
ahead.
I somehow figured it out. Thank you, Margaret, for your talk. I agree, it's a really timely discussion given the developments yesterday. And it was really nice. I like how you laid everything out. My question is, how does the Kyrgyz case, how does it differ from everything? Because, you know, on the books, Kyrgyzstan is the only parliamentary republic in Central Asia. And so obviously that bodes, and it's always hailed as this bastion of democracy. But a lot of people say after 2 revolutions, and I'm so glad that you mentioned the clan politics and the regional divides, that there's too much politics and this isn't helping getting anything done. So I'm wondering if you can explain a little bit why Kyrgyzstan is, regardless of the fact that all of these things with authoritarianism are going on, it still is a parliamentary republic. It still has a tumultuous politics to deal with. How does it differ in this methodology from Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan?
So I think that there's a couple key that's a great question. I think there's a couple key differences. So in terms of outcome, you're right. I don't know that we can really speak of Kyrgyzstan as an island of democracy, but it's certainly more competitive than the other countries in the region, and so it had a different outcome. And I think it had a different outcome in part because of how Akayev initially dealt with those regional elites. So he really sort of let them take the reins in a lot of ways initially after independence, and then tried to take that power back. And that didn't work very well, right? So in Uzbekistan, Karimov acted very quickly and strategically to undercut a lot of these elites, to either buy them off, reshuffle them, that sort of thing. And as a result, in this really critical period after the Soviet collapse, where everyone's expectations were still kind of like, we don't know what's going to happen, in Uzbekistan, Karimov managed to create this impression that, yeah, it's probably a better idea to go along with him than it is to try and resist. In Kyrgyzstan, you had the opposite. Kazakhstan was somewhere in the middle. So you did see, and as a result, you see this resistance emerge from elites, and it's funneled through parliament because they're represented in that institution. And then the ability to buy off enough elites in order to enact institutional change was also really important. So both Karimov and Nazarbayev had patronage resources, right? In Uzbekistan, that was mostly cotton, and in Kazakhstan, it was mostly oil, but they were able to use their control over those resources to peel off enough opposition and co-opt it to push through institutional changes that then blocked opposition-minded elites from parliament and from having a forum to oppose them. In Kyrgyzstan, Akayev, with foreign aid, was able to do that a little later for a while, but it just proved to be not enough. And I think in part because of those initial expectations that were set at the beginning of how power would be distributed. Once they were set, they were hard to change.
And if I may, I'm just curious, can you talk a little bit more about then the elites kind of eating away but in Kyrgyzstan with this north-south divide? Because if it's patronage resources that made the difference, and that's why we have a parliamentary republic now, with so many other factors, would you say it's the north-south divide that has really determined that fate?
I mean, I think the fact that there is a divide and Akayev didn't act to undercut those elites early, because there were really strong regional divides in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan as well. So that's not something, the fact that it's along the north-south is different in Kyrgyzstan, but the fact that there are regional differences is not something that's unique to the country.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Logan, do you have a question for Dr. Hansen?
I do, thank you. It's also regarding Kyrgyzstan, as both me and Chris were there last summer, so I'm much more familiar with Kyrgyzstan. So I was just wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about what role you think in Kyrgyzstan in particular, ethnic violence between, ethnic Kyrgyz and ethnic Uzbeks, specifically in the south of the country, in the Fergana Valley region, what role maybe that played to, there were some people that I talked to last summer in Kyrgyzstan who kind of felt that maybe this was used as, this was maybe not necessarily encouraged, but allowed by the government to take place in an effort to try and maybe create a little bit of this idea of, Kyrgyzstan, all the Kyrgyz are together against the outsiders, and maybe that was a way for the people who are in power to stay in power. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about the role that ethnic violence down there might have played.
I mean, I think that's not wrong, that that sort of othering has been used to try and eat away at the regional identities, but the extent to which it's actually been successful seems pretty limited. But it's certainly a very classic strategy in terms of nation building to, unfortunately, to other one group in an attempt to create a sense of national identity. But there's a lot of other things underlying the regional divide, from language to the different patronage networks tend to be constructed along those regional lines. So I'm not sure how successful it's actually been.
Okay, Daniel, do you have a question for Dr. Hansen as well?
Oh, hello. Well, first, thank you for the presentation. And have you written a book, or if you will, I'll be the first to read it. Because
We love that question mark, Dr. Hansen.
The book is a work in progress, but it's actually about corruption and governance. This paper is part of a larger project, actually an international effort on parliamentary closures and authoritarian rule around the world. So it's
okay, so I'm gonna look, because I eat this stuff up about Central Asia. So I actually first worked in Kyrgyzstan in '94, and then in '98, and then I hadn't been back for 20 years. And I've been in Tajikistan, and I'm hoping to move to Uzbekistan shortly. I'm just curious, two quick questions is, do you have any future prognostications about how you see that, what the current people are doing, or where you see where you, I'm talking about the current three rulers, and where you see how they might handle their parliaments? That, for instance, Mirziyoyev is giving a lot more, well, at least he's saying in Uzbekistan, he's giving more power to the parliament. He wants them to do more, to step up, to do more things. And I'm also just curious if you also, this may not be here or there, if you have any, feeling on outside powers, particularly the USA, Russia, and China, how they affect the ability of the president to stay in power and maybe to manage parliament. I mean, I just have my own personal thoughts. I think that all three countries had some role directly or indirectly in causing the two overthrows in Kyrgyzstan, but that's for another time. So just, how do you see the current rulers handling their parliaments going forward more, and if you have any thoughts on outside powers and how they affect that? Thank you.
So going forward, unfortunately, I suspect that Kazakhstan is going to become more repressive. I think with Nazarbayev formally stepping down and Tokayev taking on the role of president, there was people were very frustrated in general, and were hoping for some change, and the country has developed a lot. There's much greater awareness of and how things operate in other parts of the world. It's become much more cosmopolitan in the major cities. The income level has increased pretty dramatically. And so with this, this development has come an increased push for greater government accountability that's generated the Oyan movement and this new wave of civic activism. And so I think the regime is kind of at a crossroads where they either need to open up more and allow more competition and participation by citizens, or they're going to have to really repress much more than they have in the past. And unfortunately, the events around the elections where the protests were quashed, and in general, what political science tells us is, as well, is that personalist regimes like Nazarbayev's are the least likely to transition to a more competitive type of regime, such as democracy or even competitive authoritarianism. So I don't like to make crystal ball predictions, but I think it's probably going to become more repressive. Even more so than has been going on in recent years. In Uzbekistan, I think Mirzayev is really taking Kazakhstan as a model in a lot of ways. He wants to attract foreign direct investment. You do that by being a less blatantly awful dictator. But you're still a dictator.
Right.
So I think he's really taking Kazakhstan in the 2000s as a sort of model, and dialing back a lot of the repression, taking a softer hand, but I don't think he's actually interested in devolving power to parliament. I think it'll continue to just be a softer type of personalism. Kyrgyzstan is an excellent question on that one, because with the recent indictment of the former president, I'm not sure, to be honest. I think Kyrgyzstan is probably the most difficult one to predict. But I do think in a certain respect, like I was talking about in the presentation, the cat's out of the bag, and that people expect there to be some degree of competitiveness, and expectations are self-reinforcing in a lot of ways. So they see there being some elites in particular see there as being something to gain from standing up to who's in power, and so you're going to continue to see some kind of back and forth. And I'm sorry, could you reiterate the second part of your question?
Well, I guess it was, what do you see of the role of outside powers? I mean, Tajikistan and Iran have issues now, but I'm talking about mainly USA, Russia, and China. Their role in the stability of these governments, or getting, doing things behind the scenes to whether intentionally or unintentionally, directly or indirectly, to get rid of some of the leaders. Like in Kyrgyzstan, there were 2 overthrows and so on. So does any of your research, maybe it doesn't, but I'm just curious, touch on the role of these major powers, and outside forces that can sort of cause things?
I mean, that's not the area of my research, so
Right.
I can sort of speak to it generally, but it's not my area of expertise. There's certainly a strong and growing presence of China throughout the region, particularly economically, but that's inherently political. And I think we'll continue to see that. Russia maintains an interest and a presence there as well. And so does the US, but in a lot of ways we've withdrawn. There's your sort of continued standard supporting youth activism, etc., kind of programs, but I don't think that efforts of diplomats who are interested in the region to really attract more dedicated interest from the administration in the U.S. is working particularly well. So, you know, there's still some things that continue, but it's increasingly sort of a Russian, it feels, again, this is not my particular area of expertise, but it feels like an increasingly kind of Russia-China game.
I would agree with that, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So we have another question for Dr. Hansen. Sarah, please go ahead.
Hi, I'm Sarah. And so I'm wondering about the role that you see the informal sector in regards to like activism, NGOs, locals, and the resistance or the way that they're kind of undermining these institutional changes within the parliament and the government. If you see that at all, or even these local and regional elites, what types of resistance are you seeing in this?
So I'm most familiar with that in the case of Kazakhstan. So there, I think you really do see a growing, for one, there's a hollowing out of legitimacy of the regime. And that's happening at a time when the country has developed a lot more. And there's a lot of literature in political science that argues over whether development leads to democratization or not. But certainly, I would say that development in Kazakhstan does seem to be contributing to a higher...
Love to work from home. Okay, I'm sure she'll be back. We want to know how that sentence ends.
We almost made it all the way through without an interruption from my canine companions. There's 3 of them in the background. Okay, so in Kazakhstan, at least, it seems to be the case that these higher levels of development, education, et cetera, connection to the outside world are really contributing to a growing impetus for activism, and new organizations are sprouting up that are really youth-led in large part by this generation that didn't know Soviet rule. In a way that's not occurring in the other countries. So I think we can link that to development. And it's happening at a time, again, when the regime is pretty unpopular. So that's giving it, I think, added fuel. There's a lot of really creative activism going on in Kazakhstan. In Uzbekistan, it's pretty absent. I mean, the Karimov regime was so repressive that there just wasn't really even any space for that to occur. And it's still recovering. I think right now people are just, at least when I was there last summer, people just seemed excited and happy about the changes that were occurring. There wasn't a particular movement to challenge the regime. And in Kyrgyzstan, it's the case I'm the least familiar with, but it does seem to be a continuation in many ways of what Radnitz argued in his book, that people are, when they take to the streets, a lot of times it's because they're responding to elites' calls, and it's elites who have supported them in the absence of the state really providing much in the way of, let's say, public services. But there are some, I mean, you know, there were the women's protests in Bishkek, like there's some kernels of activism, but I think it will have a more difficult time gaining traction there due to the lower levels of development.
Okay. So thank you to our audience for those wonderful questions. We're just about out of time. I was just hoping that Dr. Hansen, that you could share a bit about your approach to this research. I, as an anthropologist, don't necessarily always think of political scientists as going out and talking to people, but I know that you've done a lot of that. So I thought it would be interesting for the people here to hear a bit about how you approach data gathering.
Sure. So, I mean, I am a political scientist, and political science is a very sort of empirically driven field. So we really love statistics. But, most of you probably know that a lot of the data that does exist for a region of the world like Central Asia is terrible. You can't necessarily trust the quality. I remember being on a hike in Tajikistan with a top official there, a top international organization official, and we were talking about data, and she said, do you know where the World Bank gets the various statistics and data points that all of you use in your models? They get it from the Tajik government. And if you really believe what you're getting, then you're overly optimistic, because they don't have the capacity or the incentives to provide accurate data. So as a result, and the things I study like corruption, are hidden phenomena. So it's tough to get direct information about them. So I triangulate. I try and figure out, in a lot of ways, I treat it as sort of like building a criminal case. Okay, what pieces of evidence would you need to see in order to be convinced that person X committed the crime, or that such and such an outcome is really the result of what I'm arguing it to be the result of? And so that involves everything from doing surveys or survey experiments to interviews, to ethnographic observation, where I embed myself in a community or observe a court case or something like that, to as well officials' statistics taken with a grain of salt. It's sort of like throw whatever evidence you can at it, and that means taking a much broader approach than is traditional in political science.
And do you speak any of the languages of these places?
So I primarily operate in Russian. I took quite a bit of Kazakh, but in Kazakhstan, for the most part, if you speak Russian well, and that becomes evident after you assure them that you are studying Kazakh, they switch back to Russian. So it's gotten a little rusty. And I've studied Tajik as well.
And we were hoping to offer Uzbek during the academic year this year, but that didn't, our FLTA placement didn't work out. So unfortunately, we're not going to be able to do that, but maybe next summer, Dr. Hansen will join us for our Uzbek program. So you would have been in Ellie's class, actually.
Yeah, I'm hoping to study Uzbek going forward, because being in Uzbekistan, I operated fine in Tashkent in Russian, but outside of that, I think you really do need to speak Uzbek. So.
Or Tajik.
Or Tajik. Actually, I was in Samarkand, I used some Tajik. So.
Okay. Well, thank you again very much for sharing this fascinating work with us. And again, huge thank you to everyone for your really interesting questions that took the discussion even further. And we hope that you have, wherever you are, that you enjoy this 4th of July weekend very safely, of course, and that, you know, we'll see you on Monday. And thank you again, Dr. Hansen, for coming and for sharing your work with us.